Tunjukkan potensimu dan jadilah generasi pemikir masa depan.
Welcome to Yogyakarta, the city of students. The city where a significant number of public and private schools and universities are located. Universitas Atmajaya Yogyakarta, a private university established on September 27, 1965 by Yayasan Slamet Riyadi Yogyakarta.
Dalam bahasa Sanskerta, Atma berarti jiwa dan Jaya berarti unggul. Sehingga Atmajaya berarti jiwa yang unggul. Universitas Atmajaya Yogyakarta juga memiliki semboyan dalam bahasa Latin Serviens in Lumine Veritatis yang artinya melayani dalam cahaya kebenaran.
The four core values upheld by UAJY are excellence, inclusivity, humanism, and integrity. Excellence implies equality or being better than others. Inclusivity means encompassing all social groups. Humanism, the definition, means to serve the common interest of fellow humans. Integrity means adherence to the moral and ethical principles, honesty, reliability, consistency in words and acts, and a sense of responsibility. UAJY supports diverse values, cultures, religions, races, ethnicities, and languages as a university with students from all across Indonesia. UAJY's diversity is an asset for further collaboration and synergy in preparing for a better future.
Universitas Atmajaya Yogyakarta memiliki 4 kampus yang terbagi menjadi Kampus 1, Gedung Santo Alfonsus. Kampus 2, Gedung Santo Thomas Aquinas. Kampus 3, Gedung Santo Bonaventura. Dan Kampus 4, Gedung Bunda Teresa. Universitas Atmajaya Yogyakarta memiliki fakultas dengan berbagai program studi sarjana, program studi magister, dan international undergraduate program.
Universitas Atmajaya Yogyakarta is a second home for every individual to develop and share information, and a university with a high-quality education to attain unlimited aspirations and accomplishments. To achieve the goals, UAJY provides classrooms with hybrid learning system, laboratories in each faculty as a room to explore, co-working space as a discussion room, medical personnel who are always available in the university clinic room, and a library that provide books, e-books, and digital libraries to open a wide window onto the world in various ways.
UAJY selalu konsisten memberikan pelayanan yang didasari rasa solidaritas kepada sesama. Selama saya bekerja di UAJY, saya merasakan kekeluargaan yang sangat kuat menjadi dasar bagi seluruh sivitas akademika.
UAJY endeavors to develop graduates who are ethical, creative, innovative, adaptive, transformational, collaborative, and benevolent. All these are aimed to help students achieve their future dreams.
Mendidik itu mengajarkan ilmu pengetahuan
dan berbela rasa, serta berkontribusi pada kesejahteraan masyarakat. Hal tersebut menjadi landasan fundamental bagi Universitas Atmajaya Yogyakarta untuk mencetak generasi muda yang unggul di bidangnya dan memiliki integritas moral yang tinggi. Saya bangga menjadi bagian dari Universitas Atmajaya Yogyakarta. Viva UAJY, kami bangga ada di sini.
Selamat siang kepada Ibu Dr. Maria Iren Veronica Hergiono sebagai Kepala Pusat Prestasi Nasional dan segenap tim Pusat Prestasi Nasional. Dan untuk semua para penonton dari debater maupun juri-juri N1 serta semua sekalian, saya izin untuk berpindah ke bahasa Inggris karena acara Grand Final dari LDI Bahasa Inggris sudah segera akan dimulai. Welcome everyone to finals of LDI English 2025. The prep time for the teams is up, so we're going to start the grand final round very soon. Before that, we're going to introduce the stellar 9 panel judges who will be judging the open finals of LDI English 2025. Firstly, Anisha Alistasia from Nusa Tenggara Barat. Open champion of NUDC 2021 and all the other achievements that you can see on the screen. The second is Beauty Ariel Benyuwanto SPSI from DKI Jakarta. As the champion, finals best speaker of Australs 2022 and all the other achievements. Next, Jones Anderson from Sumatera Utara. Champion of IFET 2024, Al-Sawi 2024, and NSDC 2021 also as the 5th best speaker. The next judge in the panel is Elgard Mario Wiandika Esos from Jawa Barat. Champion of IFET, Ganesha Open, Smash Open, and Dipo Open, and all the other achievements that you can see from the screen. Next, Kevin Rendra Pratama Esos from Jawa Tengah. Champion and top 10 best speaker and grand finalist of a lot of competitions as you can see from the screen. Marvel Samgar Amadeus ST from Sulawesi Selatan as champion of Al-Sawi 2023, finalist of Argumentum IV and all the other competitions. Yulianti SM from Kalimantan Barat as open grand finalist of Kode Prakademi and open octo finalist of IFET 2025. Yvonne Eng from Kepulauan Riau, best EFL team of WSDC 2024 and semi-finalist of NSDC 2023. Chairing the open final round is a member of CAP, Manda Bagaskara SA, open semi-finalist of Audipo Open, novice grand finalist, and CAP of a lot of different competitions. Those are going to be the stellar 9 panel judges who are going to be adjudicating the open final round of LDI English 2025. For the details and for the process of the competition, I'm going to give the floor to Manda as the chair.
All right, hello everyone. My name is Manda, good at you for this round. Now I'd like to welcome both grand finalists for LDI English divisions this year. In propositions team, we have the team from Banten. Give massive applause for all of them. For team Banten, we will also mention the speaker's name of all the teams. The first speaker, we have Kalisa Najla Manggala. The second speaker would be Sen Levi Danuse Putra. The third speaker will be Abian Zaki Harahap. And the reply will be Sen Levi Danuse Putra. In oppositions, we'll have the teams from Bali. In the first speaker, we have Putura Kaila Galuh Safitri. In the second speaker, we have Nadine Tirza Amadia. In the third speaker, we have Edgar Wirasa Smita. And the reply will be Putura Kaila Galuh Safitri. Okay, before we start the final round, there are several reminders, especially for the participants. So please maintain your volumes, especially when you talk to each other. Please avoid any kind of sign toward the debaters. It includes like saying here, here, or give applause and etc. You can give applause after the debaters finish their speech, but please avoid any kind of disruptions. Maintain your volume as well so the judges can hear clearly the debaters during their speech. For debaters, don't forget to use your own timer during your speech. POI is also highly encouraged. Please also use your microphone. Just test it before you start the debate. Okay. In the final round, we are going to discuss about economic, which is the motion for this round will be This House believes that sovereign wealth funds owned by developing countries should prioritize allocating funds to international investment over domestic investments. With that said, I would like to invite the first propositions to open the debate for this round. Here.
Capital to come in from these foreign investments, we win from the very first speech. I want to set up this debate then quite intensively because we want a clear debate. The first point is, what do we consider domestic industries and how are they picturized? We think it's three things. One, look at the motion slide, Judge. Exactly when they tell you that they're going to invest in these very preliminary things, i.e. things like, for example, food safety, green energies, which is most likely that these industries are going to be primary, i.e. things like, for example, palm oil, things like, for example, coal, things like, for example, nickel and metals and whatnot. But two, even if they're not, we say that they go to premature deindustrialization, which means that at the point in which, for example, a lot of countries like EU and America are pumping up their manufacturing, it means it gives up huge incentive for these developing countries to then just start selling their raw materials instead of investing in their manufacturing. So we say even if they went through a period of manufacturing, that's going to decrease because these countries are incentivized to just ship them off to foreign states. But two, it's also on the unskilled workers, and it's important because this means that there's also less likelihood for foreign investments to come in, exactly because of, first, on the lack of education, but also two, on the bunch of, like, for example, things like our children are born with less likelihood of being able to get the nutrients they need to be able to compete. Others are going to say, like, this is exactly why the urgency, why we need to fund these things. Note then four things. One, you need time, which means the fact that you invest in education right now is only going to manifest 20 years later. And this is important because most likely developing countries have a window in which they are, like, productive, or a window in which they can, like, solve their economic crisis, because things like debt have things like interest, which means that they're going to pile up over the course of years. But two, note to you that the difference between the foreign wealth funds in developing nations and developed nations is the transparency. You can look at things like, for example, in Sweden and in Alaska, where you have things like referendums to decide what the foreign wealth funds invest in. You don't have that in developing countries, which is most or less likely for these impacts to materialize insofar you invest them in domestically. But three, it's also the political instability in these own countries. Not even insofar as an old guard or ruling party in power, then they have the power to, for example, halt this type of development insofar they want to cater to another specific group, so they have to prove to you how this thing is going to be sustainable. But the fourth point is, even in best case scenario that you have this, then we see it's symmetrical, because note that sovereign wealth funds exist separate from the ministries of economy, from all of these different things controlling the economy. They have to prove to you the exclusivity why we need these individuals then to solely invest into investment inside the country. Because here's the thing then about state-owned enterprises. I'm going to posit to you two possibilities. One, that these are already heavily funded in the get-go because they operate at a loss. We say that probably that the budget you have to consolidate for them is going to remain the same every single year. So we question the urgency on why you need specifically a sovereign wealth fund to be able to cater to this. But two, they're either so good because they monopolize an entire industry, which at that point you need to fund them, and because they just give the people what they need. So state-owned enterprises are out of this debate. The third thing I want to talk about then is on the principle of this debate. Note that you're going to say, we need to protect the people, we need to make sure the people are properly fed. Note to you that this is only a principle that is only materialized insofar that you have the capital you need, so far I can prove to you that we win. What is then our path to victory? First, on why domestic industries are volatile. Two, why international bonds or investments are comparatively then less. And two, how we get better economic development. And three, better economic development under our side of the house. Firstly then, on why domestic industries are volatile. are. First, that they usually export raw commodities. And this is important because note that the price of oil right now is very going up and down. Comparatively, when you look at international bonds, because they're tied to a specific country's economy, there was multiple state actors are incentivized to make sure that they're not going down, not because they're not going to give not only because they're not going to give a return to the investment, but also because the people in a specific country are also going to suffer at the point that bond goes down. But two, it's also on the political instability and uncertainty, which means that even if you invest onto these countries, that it's much likely that they're not going to go to the point in which they materialize for the individuals at the bottom. But three is also on the corruption. Note that this exists much more in developing states exactly because they're much more proximate to the sovereign wealth funds. They're more likely to be able to siphon off cash and like money from it. The fourth point then is also it's hyper competitive. Look at, for example, the industry is in China and India when they're fighting for the same commodities, the same market, which is most likely that even if you invested that, the return is not going to be that large exactly because you're competing with other countries with better infrastructure than you. The fifth point is look at what's happening in the world right now, panels. Firstly on the tariffs and so second on the global economic slowdown because of things like the Ukraine and Gaza and Sudan war. Which is most likely that even if you invest in your economy right now, it's not going to be able to materialize fully exactly because people are just struggling to get jobs, not because of the government in of itself, but also because of all these other external factors you can't control. Comparatively, this is better under us of the House because we said that the international bonds we are going to invest in are going to go through this for the survival of the fittest process. With the international bonds that are going to be marketable, the international bonds that are going to seem attractive are obviously the ones that are going to be less affected by the tariffs and less affected by all of the factors I told you. What's the weighing? And so far we can prove to you that we don't have to prove to you that these foreign investments will be 100% safe. We just have to prove to you that they're less volatile. That's already a delta we can take in this debate. Why then is international investments less volatile? I think it's three things. One, not only when you buy from developing countries, it's better because it's more stable because of all the check and balances that exist in there to ensure that their economy doesn't crash. But two, I'm going to talk about markets. Note to you that when you invest in certain industry like palm oil and nickel, that means that any sort of shift in that specific market means that there's going to be a high chance of your investment going to a loss. Comparatively, when you invest in whole things with countries that know what they're doing, means they're much more likely to see things like, for example, what's happening in the macro economy and know that it's going to be more stable. But three, I'm going to explain to you how we get less politicization and corruption under our side of the House. I think it's two things. One, note that the proximity means local companies can lobby, and also in the fact that these countries have also way less check and balances to prevent this from happening. But two, note that these foreign companies are also beholden to the countries where they're from. So even if you invest in a foreign company, they're less likely to be able to do things like lobby because the country of their home state also has like several mechanisms to prevent these type of companies from lobbying in the first place. The third thing I want to talk about then in this debate is how you get better economic development. First thing I want to posit is note that the problem with economic development is usually capital under two ways. One, because most of these countries are overpopulated. Most of these countries have things like, for example, instability and mass migration and low sense of education. And so the problem isn't that we don't have like the money, but either one, that it's not optimal, or two, it's just there's not enough money to be able to go around for all of the different sectors. But two, note that the wording of this motion that the developing countries matter, because what every single developing country wants is to become a developed countries under three ways. One, it's because you get like more access to things like, for example, loans. You get things like more access, like for example, trust from international bodies to give you things, and so forth, that you show to them that I can get this enough capital, I'm able to give you returns. But two, note that the prerequisite for public participation, for the public to start caring about what their country does, is when they have a source of trust. Trust can only be earned in two ways. One, then there's like past presidents, and so far this is probably something new because this is a developing country, you can't have that. But two, it's also when things happens like tangible returns, which are at the point in which these individuals are able to get return from their foreign investment. There's headlines saying that we made this much money from all of our investments. It's much more likely for the public to say like, oh, this thing is actually working. But the third thing I want to posit then, note that it's also on the workers that are taken. And so far that these are like international bonds, it means you're going to get more educated people who are managing them, because the point of education you need to manage international bonds is higher than domestic. For that reason, propose.
I think to the first proposition for the fine speech. Now I'd like to invite first oppositions to the debate in opposition side. Here. Reminder for debaters to please offer and accept one POI. Thank you.
Testing, testing, check, check. I'm guessing I'm audible. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Panels, one thing I agree on Proposition's bench entire speech, that all developing countries want to be developed countries. Although there's one crucial thing that they miss. Every single developed countries out there are already stable in the very first place before they can actually opt into more international investment. Proud to oppose. Before I go on to my arguments, I'd like to posit 2 main points of setup. A, regarding what does domestic investment actually look like, because they never touched on that underside proposition. We think that this is quite simple, like prioritizing investment on the essentials of the country, such as simply roads, such as schools, such as healthcare for the people as a whole, for the people to actually have more job opportunities, to open up the job opportunities to said people in the country, right? That's what the government is promised and actually is accountable to do for us for so long on status quo. But also, secondly, simply, what our goal is in this debate is to prove to you that we don't want for big companies such as Hyundai to actually be reaching out to us, or more importantly, like what Proposition is trying to do, we don't want to actually try to bribe those companies ourselves. We want them to actually come themselves to our country, for them to actually be interested in the country, not for us to actually have to pull them to our side of the house. In cities, regions, that probably, and we think that these companies, while they invest in Proposition side, they probably invest in more urban areas. That's more because they think that urban areas are more potential as well. But thirdly, let's tackle regarding corruption, because this likelihood is very bad. Because if they're that bad to the corruption, we think that regardless if it's from domestic investment, regardless if it's international investment, they still going to find corruption either way. Under both sides of the house, we fail to see this harm being exclusive on our side. Our burden here is simple. No, thank you. If we can prove to you that, one, why we actually benefit more people on our side, but secondly, why we actually get more investors on our side, we simply win this debate. On to number 1 then. First argument then, regarding the local economy as a whole. We posit to you 2 main layers of urgency. One, we think that in the current status quo, it's quite intuitive when we say that infrastructure is quite lacking, that it's not earning enough, that's things like transports, that things like schools are still quite underdeveloped, that our curriculum in itself is underdeveloped. As student, I really feel this. Not enough incentive for small businesses to actually thrive in the current status quo. When school still has holes in its roofs, when the toilet is still flushing, when road stops trucks of food from actually going in rural areas, this is what makes investors actually uninterested in developing countries in the very first place, because on top of hiring people like to count tax, hiring people to actually map the country, etc., it's just simply making things more expensive for them. But secondly, we think that foreign investors feel that developing countries are quite unprofitable, even with the abundance of resources in the status quo. We not only want to trade with them, but we want to make a partnership with them. We want them to be interested and to actually branch out to the rural areas at the end of the day, and we'll explain to you why we'll get that likelihood. Yan, later. But also, regarding the solvency, how do we solve this then? We posit to you 4 main layers of analysis. We think that 1, this looks like us focusing on SLWF, on things like schools, on things such as roads. We actually fix those schools. We actually properly fix our curriculum. We actually fix those roads to actually rural areas that has gold, that has nickel, etc., on the cities developing, focusing on the people and their interests at the end of the day. But also, secondly, for so long, the only tool we have in the current status quo to actually earn a company's interest is things like tax breaks, in things like safety net that other countries such as India, that other countries such as Malaysia can easily replicate, right? That's the only tool we have to actually track company. The delta of our case, however, is we double the incentive when now company like Freeport don't need to actually invest on roads when we actually handle it ourselves. We provide it for them in the current status quo. We make it more accessible for them to actually reach these rural areas. That's how we actually get development and more jobs on rural areas on our side at the end of the day. But on to my 3rd layer then, we think that every single country has some sort of bureaucratic nightmare. Because when an investor wants to actually invest here, they still need people to handle taxes, they still need people to handle transport, and they still need people to handle mapping. And these are most likely the locals, right? When they know the culture here, when they know the land here better than any other people that they can hire from their company later, the locals still get money under our side of the house exactly because of this. But fourthly then, they're likely to bring in outside technology, especially when these people actually branch out to the rural areas due to the infrastructure we built. When we double their instead of the current status quo, when we actually fix things, they can actually branch to rural areas, etc., and actually make them livable. Before I go on to my second argument, sure, I'll take a point.
Why are the multiple ministries and state enterprises not enough to invest on the things you mentioned?
Can you repeat the PLI?
Why are the multiple ministries and state enterprises not enough to invest on the things you mentioned?
We think that in the current status quo, exactly intuitively, that resources are limited. But we think to actually gain more capital exactly under our side of the house, not only do we have to actually fix the wages in the current status quo, make people actually have jobs so we can actually gain taxes from their jobs to incentively make people actually be productive in the current status quo. So the produce, such as the agriculture, actually be better in the current status quo, so people can actually fix things in the current status quo, is exactly why we'll get more capital. But other than that, exactly when the mechanism that I've already posited to you regarding on why companies will be more incentivized to actually invest under our side of the house when we actually fix things and not actively just trying to pull them through like bribery or something like under your side of the house. But on to my second argument then regarding market volatility, we posit to you two things under our side, which is a flip on the entire first case argument. On to number one regarding the international market, right? We think that the international market is super volatile. It's already super saturated in the current status quo at the end of the day. It's hard to compete with well-established companies with more well-established countries like Russia, like China, even our neighbor Singapore, right? And more developed companies as a whole. But secondly then, the international market is again volatile due to the ever-changing policy. There are currently global tension between players like US, China, Russia. That is to say, when it's already hard and it's volatile, it's not worth it when there's no guarantee of income, because you as a developing country has limited resources. You need to invest in something more proper. You need to invest in something more certain to make sure it actually doesn't go to waste at the end of the day. What is the impacts of this then? We think that one, when we're giving people hope, when you make a voter wait, like in the current status quo, you make them doubt the government. When you make people suffer longer, they lose trust on the government, specifically on your side. Meanwhile, on our side, when we focus on them first, ASAP, we help them first, we actually have more willing voters on our side, right? So they won't do things like tax evasion or something, at least in the current status quo, when they already trust the government to actually manage the resources. But if we have infrastructure, if we can finally have factories on our side to process the abundance of resources to actually make it valuable, like our mechanization has stated to you, we also invest in factories on our side. For example, we make sands from beaches to actually glass or something, because that doesn't need like such advanced technology like to make EVs as comparison under our side. Many people can opt into it. The importance of this argument lies when the government has the accountability to actually fulfill their promises, their obligation to prioritize the people ASAP. When you pay taxes for healthcare, when you pay taxes for food and stable prices first, when you don't get that ASAP, people start to question government under your side of the house specifically. But secondly, when countries like Indonesia become over-reliant on other countries to feed its people, when they become over-reliant on countries like Russia or the US or China, they'll be dependent on these big players too much. When you have the bare minimum, when you have a sustainable wheat field, when you actually can become independent yourself, at least make sure that your product is enough in the current status quo to feed your people. When you make sure that your product is enough to actually survive the global volatility, at least to a bare minimum, we proudly win this debate.
Thank you, first opposition, for that fine speech. To respond to the case, I would like to invite second prop.
At the top of my speech, I want to make two strategic observations just to take down opposition case. One, we do not contest the importance of domestic development, but the debate is specifically with respect to the SWF and not from the perspective of the governments. It is therefore disingenuous for OPT to impose the burden of national development for two reasons. First, one, SWF functions as a diversified savings and stabilization vehicle and not as a domestic development bank. I want to identify the historical emergence of why the SWF emerged in the first place. SWF historically emerged from states who had volatile or like exhaustible sources of income like oil, gas, and mineral royalties, and the government wants to transform that into a stable, more diversified financial wealth across time. This is why SWF is distinct for two simple reasons on mandate. First, the obligation of SWF is for citizens to 20 to 30 years in the future, not now, not in the next election cycle. This is also to weigh things in like long-term versus short-term. But note, the whole point of SWF is to reduce exposure to the same shocks under the domestic economy. Instead of holding ongoing under the ground of like domestic bonds, the state says that like, we have a global mix of assets. The entire purpose, right, of this particular thing is that in a downturn, when commodity prices crash, as Kalika has clearly told you, or in capital fleece, the SWF can be drawn to stabilize the budget and stabilize the economy. So revenues from a coal farm or a palm oil farm can do things like be worth something in the future when these industries are particularly like the population ages and this particular like economy's downturn. But second, note that SWF is deliberately taken out of normal bureaucracy and given an investment committee with a clear benchmark. Things like the 6-7. Like note, this notes that this builds a global index over the long run with a clear given risk. So note, the performance and success of this SWF is judged on the terms of risk and adjusted return, and not just how many roads is built in District X or how many jobs is saved in District Y. Why are these like framings round-winning panel? First, it just breaks the entire deadlock that has happened across first exchange, on which you should principally prioritize and suggest that on our side, we have a third-party observer, because this house believes that motion, which means you should revert back to the mandate of a specific body, in this case the SWF. And so the main metric of the debate should not be about domestic development, but on risk diversification. So if your economy is already overexposed to domestic risk, the rational thing as SWF, as a savings vehicle to do, is to like not double down on that same risk factor. But if, second, the reason why should like revert back to our original mandate of the body is just to avoid over concentrating on like these particular things, because note, the funds allocated in this one sector is passed across multiple bodies, and this is very important because all of opposition bench is just like, oh, you're excluded insofar as there are like separate functions mandating for domestic developments. What do we have in status quo? Three ways. First, we have budget and line ministries, because note that currently the budget and the ministry are explicitly allowed to choose things like rural leaders or things like create roads that never have like generate full toll revenue and things like that. But note, this is very important because these projects have like they don't have direct cash flow. What the NBIT like APBN ministries particularly do and build this particular thing is like spending agencies. Spending on our side just offers budgets in a way that citizens, media, and parliament can see, and so the distributional choices that happen on our side of the house is just much better because there's a basis of public, and this is debated publicly to like target equity goods, so they can deliberately push more funding in poor or rural areas. But note, even in projects, these are fiscally costly. Note that like a lot of SWF has neither the mandate nor the institutional wiring to make this distinction based on decisions of the kind, because note, the models built around like portfolio management are not necessarily immediate infrastructure projects for public goods. But second, even if you buy that ministries have not been effective in alternatives, we do have other things like developmental banks and other institutional infrastructure frameworks like PT SME or in Indonesia, or like in PT Benjamin Infrastructure Indonesia, which can all do things like lend more or do things like impact like commercial terms. Note, these are very important because these are not available for the SWF and guarantees like viable gap funding, which are not specifically crafted to focus on things like sectors with spillover. So note, the question of opposition that they have to answer is why SWF? This is not a debate about urgency, it is a debate specific to the SWF. Why exactly this SWF and not the current like bodies that already have these particular things to accept lower financial returns for higher social impact that already operate under public investment and procurement rules? I already know what Diallo is gonna say, which is that he's gonna tell you that like, oh, there's not effective and it's not effective and it's not good. 3 points of weighing just to crystallize from DPM. First, the problem is ineffectiveness is not solved under their side of the house, for the reason that even if like SWF is created, the same ministries and the same local elites will just like lobby the SWF. The same government who prioritizes bad projects into the budget will still push these things into SWF. The distinction is you destroy the fund's ability to do things like openly financial grounds, and once a developmental impact is part of the SWF remit, any politically framed project requires a developmental level to justify it. But even if we bite the bullet, few responses as to why this is an independent pathway to victory and why you ought not to politicize the SWF. Few things. First, this is plainly ineffective because if you to duplicate capacity and pipelines, because that same toll road, that same port will be still put out simultaneously to the budget, to the developmental banks, to the SWF. Each institution runs its own analysis and negotiates separately and fights for the ownership of the deal. And there is a distinct ways of technocratic meritocratic talent that happens in developing countries. But second, when you force the SWF to do things like focus on developmental domestically, you just over-concentrate that in the same risk factors. And that's just bad because your economy is naturally fragile. And if SWF becomes domestically like finite, right, its effect starts to like resemble that of like existing problems. And this is bad because the other explosions are necessary because it's heavily domestic and things like reverse on the, and it is contingent on the domestic GDP and breaking with like loads of corporate consumer risk. And that's just particularly bad. So when the economy is bad, by like a negative shock, the falling commodity prices or global downturn hitting exports, you just get correlated losses everywhere. Like you have things like taxes that are falling, like domestic asset prices that are losing, and this just compounds over time. And now on their side of the house, SWF assets also simultaneously fall. This is very important. In opposition, to be clear, you lose the SWF ability to do things like stabilize funds because it no longer has an externally large liquid diversified portfolio that can be like it can be diversified everywhere. And this is very important because on their side, they are not exposed to the same macro shades and macro like harms that happen to the rest of the economy. So at that moment, the state dependently push an uncurated push of wealth at the top, and if the SWF is domestically heavy, it cannot play with that stabilization role and it just collapses with everything else. Furthermore, note that the SWF is seen as a domestic development actor. So like every major domestic actor and every like mayor and government wants to push things like political coalitions for the infrastructure. Like a government who wants a highway or an airport, therefore like pushes towards that particular SWF and faces and pushes and lobbies against them. This is very important because on our side of the house, if the SWF sits somewhere outside of the normal budget process, it becomes convenient to things like bad money, public money, without calling it like spending. And so equity injection is just much worse. Why is that? What do we have to trade off? What does opposition have to trade off? First, that the KPI is unclear insofar as returns are like are unclear. Like SWF can say that we at least achieve like social goals or like projects fits commercially. They can say like at least we save jobs and just like gets away like accountability on their side of the house. You have a clear strategic asset allocation, like certain percent of goods and equities and words and things like that. But note, on our side, we have more transparent marketing because these are not things like just like adjusting for the Bloomberg aggregate and things like that. With that, the wing is very clear. SWF loses ability of stabilization and diversification. And at best case on opposition side of the world, they will still fall and it's still like safe under the same ministries on our side of the house and the development banks face. So the delta is you just lose the last needle and the last safety bank that happens in domestic currencies because uniquely, you don't have the particular safety net anymore. On our side of the house, I'm going to be very clear on risk diversification. We tell you from the get-go, the domestic development and investments are driven by the same shocks in commodity prices and political instability. But the issue with that is that on weighing, this just collapsed, and when the SWF collapsed, then everything just collapsed. Like your VAT is going to drop, like everything else is going to drop, and your consumption just inevitably builds. So what happens is the market stagnates, and you uniquely don't get any benefit on their side of the house. That's why you should vote for prop. Thank you.
I thank to the second prop for that fine speech. Next, the second opposition.
If Banten was really concerned of domestic risk, how you solve it is by developing it and not leaving it. If their whole argument is about how domestic investment shouldn't get the SWF, it was because it was too fragile. It's fragile because we don't get the fund because Banten is allocating it on their side of the house and we can get that on our side of the house. This debate does not exist in the vacuum for 3 reasons. Firstly, how does a developing country look like? We think that A, the infrastructure is insufficient in the status quo. Why? The money resources is limited, right? This is to say that the SWF of the developing countries is already minimum itself, right? It is crucial that it is only going to pass it into what is truly needed the most. This is to say that secondly, we think that these developing countries have the resources to do so, right? The problem in the developing countries is they don't know how to process the resources that they already have in the status quo. How does this look like? Firstly, within places like Indonesia, Philippines, and like Vietnam, they still have the actual natural resources that could be like sand, for example, that can be still developed. What the problem is existing on B, we think that the prerequisite of them is processing it well. When they actually have the infrastructure
infrastructure to process it, they need the fund for them to be allocated on our side of the house. This is why we can actually get it processed well, because we actually have the infrastructure to do so. What does these developing countries need? On three folds. Firstly, on infrastructure. Second, on labor work. Thirdly, on the help on the most urgent issue, which is to nudge the society with these sustainable research that we can posit on our side of the house. But second fold then, we think that these domestic investment, PM conceded that these are primary things, right? Exactly when it's primary thing, we need to solve them first. We think that there was never a clear understanding and a clear urgency as to why they posit about how we actually have to jump into the secondary issue as what they're trying to posit on their side of the house, right? We think that we solve the most crucial problem on our side of the house before we nudge the rest. This is why it's crucial on our side of the house. But thirdly then, on international investment, we think that they needed to posit why these investors are even interested at the first place, right? This is to say that there's have to be a big offer that they have to give on their side of the house. We already you, the SWF was never enough to actually get this investment in the first place. We question the likelihood they never recognize this. But before I move on, is there any POI?
We told you long-standing issues on why these things won't be unstable. Why when you suddenly put a lot of money to them, all the other factors disappear?
This aligned perfectly with my first clash. Three things I'll do in my speech then. Firstly, in the issue of economic stability and development. Second issue in terms of local economy and business. I'll still warn you substantive about the trickle-down effect towards society. First issue in terms of economic stability and development. They posit you three arguments. Firstly, it's volatile because the money is low because there's no help from the investment. Two responses under this. Firstly, the reason they're volatile and they volatile at the first place is because they don't have the money to do so, because you're allocating it on your side of the house. This is what manifests on your side of the house. The allocation is going to exist on our side of the house because we actually get the money. It's not going to be volatile. But second response then, we think that the money from the SWF itself can be used to replace the investment, right? Which means that we can actually get the money from the SWF itself when we can actually allocate it better on our side of the house. The second argument they bring was about how developing countries have political instability because there's corruption and they will work on their side of the house because there's lobbying. Two responses. Firstly, I think that it was never strategic for Team Banten to bring about corruption, right? Because we're clearly talking about the same actors in this debate, which is the same actors and the same political stability of these developing countries. If they really want to posit to you about how these political people are actually corrupt, it's also going to exist on their side of the house, which means that these lobbying is also not going to work. It's crumble on their side of the house. But secondly then, how lobbying work on your side of the house is never going to work when the human resource itself was never developed, right? This was we can promise to you on our side of the house because we actually focus on the primary issue itself. Their third argument was how about this domestic investment won't work because there's no human resources. Two responses. Firstly, we think that we have the increase of human resources from the educational infrastructure that we can actually promise to you on site Bali. But secondly then, we think that it's too early for them to lose hope at the first place, right? There was never any urgency that they posit about how these domestic investment was truly hopeless on their side of the house. We think that we can actually give them the opportunity and it's crucial. We think that second issue then in terms of how this affects local economy and businesses. Let's look at the comparative that happens on both sides then. We think that outside government, what investment is going to come are big companies like Hyundai, for example, which they never even posit why they even want to come at the first place. We think that they have to posit an actual offer on their side of the house, right? But even if they actually come on their very best case scenario, we think that it's still truly harmful because there was never any incentive for them to actually stay, right? We think that this is crucial. If there is no big offer on their side of the house, they're likely to just leave you, and it's going to be crucial because now these infrastructures is also going to die on your side of the house. It's never going to work. But outside opposition, at the very least, the prerequisite of these local economy to actually grow is when this local infrastructure can actually grow under our side of the house, right? That's what we posit to you, panel, and this is how we can actually manage it to better business growth on our side of the house, because now business is going to be better and these infrastructures are actually going to be positing and it's going to happen. But before that, yes.
When the domestic economy falls, what is the safety net on your side? Because that same SWF that could have been economically diverse in portfolio now invest in the same domestic asset that fall.
It was unlikely to begin with because we already posit to you how this allocating funds is also going to happen on our side of the house, right? Even if on the very worst case scenario that some actually might fail, we think that we can actually learn from these failure and we can actually happen on our side of the house as well. But lastly then, a new substantive in terms of how this trickle down effect towards the society within these developing countries. Three-layer of analysis under this. Firstly, I'll crystallize how the infrastructure actually looks like on our side of the house, right? This looks like A, villas and hotels that is going to uplift on our side of the house, but B, more schools
schools and educational infrastructure, because these are the primary thing that we can actually focus on our side of the house, and we notice that this is crucial. This is what we're going to posit on these domestic investment. But thirdly then, within the sustainable researches that's also going to exist on our side of the house, we think that we can posit to you, I'll discuss it right after this. But second layer of analysis then, how does this trickle down? Firstly, on infrastructure like hotels and villas then, we think it needs more people to work inside of it, right? When we can actually posit to you that these infrastructure are going to uplift on our side of the house, which means that the labor work is going to be uplifted on our side of the house, right? This is crucial for developing countries that have a large amount of people who's not in the labor work. We can posit to you on our side of the house because there's more infrastructure that need this labor work, and we can actually promise to you that they are going to work on our side of the house. But second layer, second point under this then, we think that the educational infrastructure that we provided is going to increase the human resources that they try to like posit so much on our side of the house. We posit to you that these educational infrastructure is going to exist on our side of the house, which means that it's also going to nudge the society as a whole, and it's also going to nudge like the increasement of the knowledge itself, and it's also going to nudge the development of these human resources, because people are going to get better education because there's more schools that exist on our side of the house, right? What does it mean then? Thirdly, when we have these educational resources and we can actually increase it on our side of the house, this is to say that the knowledge they have can be used for these sustainable researches, right? This is crucial because now these sustainable researches is what is going to nudge everyone in not only the country itself but also the world, right? We think this is crucial, especially for developing countries, because they never have the actual resources to do so. We think that by this educational infrastructure, we can posit to them the actual knowledge that can actually provide them the stepping stone in order to actually reach the sustainable researches, and it's possible. How should you weigh this then, panel? We think that the fact that we can actually trickle down into better effect and towards society, and we can nudge them specifically without having to wait for the process that take really long on their side of the house, when they actually have to firstly wait for the investment itself, secondly wait for the actual interest of the investor itself, which is really unlikely because they never posit. If they really want to posit on third speaker, it's too late. We think that what have we posited to you on my speech then? Firstly, we posit to you about how economic stability and development is going to be better on our side of the house, and we can actually achieve this local economic and stability when we actually have more infrastructures and more businesses that we can actually provide and actually prioritize on our side of the house. The trickle down is massive. I'm beyond proud to stand on Team Bali.
Thank you, second opposition, for the final speech. Next, third prop.
There's like 6 to 7 contentions on their side contingent to having investors in the first place. Insofar that you do not have any reason for investors to stay in the first place because your domestic portfolio is already horrible. Insofar that they've never proven to us that their domestic portfolio is good enough so they can get the investors, keep them from staying, then their side of the house ultimately loses on this debate. The thing is, their side of the house tries to pose it to us like an imaginary urgency, that the fact that we can get people that are educated eventually in the long time. But in the same speech, they try to tell us that, oh, we're going to build schools, we're going to make sure people are educated. That benefit is only going to manifest in 10 years. Insofar that you're going to try to develop that, their side cannot co-opt their benefit, our side is ultimately more exclusive. 2 contentions I'm going to engage to on their side of the house. Firstly, for some reason on their side of the house, they never concede to the idea that every single other ministry exists in developing countries. Is the reason that state-owned enterprises exist is because they're made to develop the country's education system. They're made to develop the country's infrastructure. And insofar that they've never conceded that why those exist, their side cannot co-opt their benefit later. The thing about the roles of the roles of SWF is that they're already told you by the DPM that they're always going to be a safety net. The fact that they're the part of the international portfolio at the end of the day, they're the clear forms of return. And if the role of the Sovereign Wealth Fund can only materialize in like 10 years and like domestic centuries, their side cannot co-opt their benefits. 2 things I'm going to crystallize in this debate. Firstly, The main issue with developing countries is that they're victims of colonialization. This is to say that most of these countries suffer from premature industrialization. The flip here is that we do have enough industries, we do have enough exports. But the problem that we have is that we're exporting crude palm oil, we're exporting raw materials, something that investors cannot maintain sustainably because they can get them cheaper from another country. Insofar that the human resources on their side of the house is never going to be as developed as our side. When we tell you that we can actually lobby with most international entities, our side can co-opt, our side can take advantage of this at the end of the day. But thirdly, we've proven to you why they're so volatile. They're heavily politicized, contingent to every single micro adjustment in comparison to how SWFs can be lobbied by companies. The fact that every single investment on our side of the house is check and balanced by every international body in an already developed economy. Therefore, the burden shift in this debate is simple. The debate is never going to be as narrow as that we have a principle to develop local country, to develop the local economy. But what roles can the Sovereign Wealth Fund develop? The fact that when we invest in bonds, international connections, our side improve the portfolio, and at worst, our side can actually gain loans, our side can actually co-op development. Before I move on, POI, sure.
If the portfolio is really that horrible, how is it going to get the incentive of the investors anyways?
Exactly, because we told you that our side of the house, when we invest in like bonds, when we invest in most of like international entities, that improves our international portfolio. Their side of the house tries to improve the domestic portfolio at the end of the day, right? And insofar that they can only manifest in like 10 years, they cannot co-op all the harms that already exist on our side of the house. This is to say that on their side of the house, maybe if we're charitable, they might be able to improve their domestic portfolio in like 10 years. However, if anything horrible happens within that time frame, then their side of the house cannot get anything from any other countries. Their side of the house cannot get any of the capabilities to like get loans or whatever, right? But let's engage on their case firstly. Firstly, they try to tell us that, oh, corruption is going to be symmetrical. Firstly, we already preempted this from PM's speech when we told you that foreign companies beholden the check and balance inside their own country, so they're less likely to be able to lobby in the first place, comparatively to their side of the house who tries to invest in local companies. But secondly, the individuals needed to manage foreign investors in the first place are already higher quality than those needed for domestic investments. So maybe if it's domestic, you can only hire the people that are not already educated in the first place. Our side ultimately co-opt this benefit. But secondly, let's get into the contentions in this debate. Firstly, they said that their side of the house wants to focus on local industries development. I think they've never given this likelihood on why then they're not volatile and they're guaranteed to make a profit at the end of the day, right? The reason why Indonesia's industry on energy and gas still use technology from the 80s is because no investor wants to help us in development when we have production to upgrade. The fact that we give that mitigation when we actually use these SWFs to perform hilarization if our supply isn't good enough, even if we have to invest in foreign entities and we have to allocate this backup fund for the most purposes, I think our side of the house can still gain that development, even eventually, that if we want to develop in the first place. But thirdly, let's be charitable and say that their urgency is real and what they want to invest in is only going to manifest within 10 years. Sure, you invest in schools, you trickle it down, but you cannot negate if your assets fail. No other country wants to lobby with you. The manifestation on their side of the house cannot even fulfill their own urgency. Then I have 2 points of weighing. To show you why we win this debate. Firstly, I think we've already given you an analysis on why we mitigate all the risk. The risk diversification is the literal lore of sovereign wealth funds. So my weighing is simple. Their side of the house takes the investment from their side. Our side of the house. Their side of the house takes the investment on domestic that international investors literally pour out of because it's so fiercely competitive. Why go to Indonesia for nickel if it's much cheaper in Vietnam, for example? Their side of the house is contingent that there's investors in the first place. We're the only side they give you this certainty because when you improve your international portfolio by investing in everything else, when you invest in bonds, when you invest in foreign industries, you have that image coming in. You have the ideation. that we can win in the worst situation at the end of the day. But thirdly, we give you the analysis of every single factor of how volatile the current market is. The fact that every single developed country is worried about their own political conflict in status quo is the exact reason why even if you invest in your own domestic economy, you're not going to be able to get any help from anyone else. It's the fact that when you as a developing country try to develop your schools, it doesn't matter if the next day every single country is at your neck because you aren't going to give them nickel or whatever. This is why we told you down the bench that the fulfillment of the sovereign wealth fund is only capable if you're able to fulfill its actual role. The fact that on our side of the house, it is never going to be domestically centric. The fact that the role on their side of the house is that, oh, our side of the house can fulfill every single burden and education. But on our side of the house, at the very least, if we're being charitable, our side of the house can fulfill that. One, we're able to get much more investment. We're able to get much more long-term lobbying on our side of the house at the end of the day. But then, what then is the only thing that stand on their side of the house is that it's the principal justification that the government should be able to cater to its people. Here's the thing. It sounds crazy, but when you try to invest in yourself and it's only going to manifest in 10 years, then it's unsure why it's going to be likely that in that 10 years something good is going to constantly happen. Whatever miracle on their side of the house that is likely for investors to want to invest in something so volatile and so unstable is never going to be manifesting as a benefit at the end of the day. Please oppose.
I think to the third prop for the final speech. Please wait a moment. Some of the judges just go to the restroom. Yep. To continue the debate, we'd like to invite third opposition here.
I'm going to be talking about two things in my speech. Firstly, is money volatile under opposition's world? And secondly, will opposition get the meaningful change fast enough? And I'll prove to you why everything they tell you is just a far-fetched pipe dream. Before my clashes then, I just want to frame out one important thing. I think that panels, you should throw away everything DPM told you about principle, because at the core of it, everything they told you on principle is attached to the success of their investment in the end of the day. So it does not stand alone as its own principle, because what they told you was like, oh, at least we invest in other means, and that is the principle as SWF. What we told you was that SWF's importance and principle is making the country richer and making the wealth management good. So insofar as we could prove to you, we have meaningful benefit in the economy under our side, we outweigh their principle. First clash then is money volatile under opposition. First thing they told you is like, you have other firms and that is sufficient. Three reasons as to why it's not. Firstly, we told you that it's unlikely to work perfect in and of itself, because if local firms were likely to work perfect in and of itself, we wouldn't even be debating this motion in the end of the day. But secondly, what we need for these local firms and for this local infrastructure is not more firms, but more money. Money injected that's only coming from SWF, right? That was the question they never answered, why the money they get from SWF under their side will be so good, and to what extent will they invest back into the country. There was no clear understanding in their model at what point of which they actually invest back into the country, and that is why they don't get infrastructure. But thirdly then, if DPM's analysis is true, that SWF is this glorified monetary body that is so disattached from everything, from all the problems of a developing country, country that it can invest in such beautiful ways and do such beautiful things, then we think it's also symmetric under our side of the house. It means that we could use this fiat to weather against all the other lobbying, all the other pressures of the government under our side of the house. Because notice panels, it was insufficient for them to say that that pressure doesn't exist under their side insofar as the money goes outwards. Because these SWF firms still have building offices here, are still hiring local people in the end of the day, right? It means like weathering against pressure of like local government is symmetric under both sides. And if they want meaningful change under their side, it means we get that too. Second thing they told you is like, oh, at least they have diversification of the economy, and it means that weather against like bad local economies. Several mitigations. Firstly, I want to point out that their characterization of diversification and economic boom, local economic boom, is insufficient because they're treating it as a zero-sum game. That insofar as there's a monetary problem in a country, the country immediately goes collapse and everything, and like the economy goes back to zero. But we tell you that it's not like that. But secondly, then when you invest more in these local economies itself, it means you get to weather against more change. We tell you that there will be that the problems of economy happens to its own certain degree, right? It's not like there's a monetary problem and every monetary problem is going to crash the economy. It means like when you invest more money in the local economy, like under our side of the house, you get to weather against that. But given that there will be fluctuation into the local economy no matter what under both sides of the house, I think it's better under ours because you actually get to weather towards like certain problems of the economy. It was unclear why that's quotable at their side of the house. But thirdly, then at the very worst case where you do get local economic booms under our side, at least you get to control the problems of the monetary economy under our side. Because under theirs, you have to invest elsewhere, to like the US, to the West, or something like that. You don't get to control the monetary policies in the US or the West. Each developing countries get to control their own monetary policies, and that is why it's unlikely to fail. Third thing they told you is like transparency is bad under our side. Three responses to that. Firstly, I think the growth is much more proximate under our side of the house because it looks like building schools, it looks like building roads, it looks like building economies, right? You see the growth on a day-to-day basis. You see schools being built, but under their side, you don't see like money getting sent and getting transferred to Goldman Sachs or something like that. It means like check and balance and scrutiny is much better under our side because people could like understand problems more. But secondly, then the comparative then is that you never know what your company is, what your country is investing in under their side. Given their own characterization that SWF is like not transparent, then why is it then likely for them to submit tax reports or to submit audits or something like that under their side? But lastly, then I want to note that if that to its own extent, it's symmetric, right? The deadlock breaker is people actually care about watching if the roads are being built. People do not care about numbers going up. It's very boring to them to look at numbers, and that is why check and balance and scrutiny doesn't exist under their side. Fourth thing they told you, oh, the companies are subject to corruption and lobbying under our side. Two responses to this. Firstly, I think there are already check and balances like the Constitution, or like people will be outraging like the recent riots or something like that. But secondly, the only way this debate is going to be charitable is if we assume the actor has a decent intention under both sides of the house. The tipping point is when you realize that they can only control local economies. Under their side of the house, you don't get to control the economies of US or something like that. It means given that these actors are decent enough to a certain extent to make this debate run, at least under our side of the house, you realize that they can control their own success. Their mitigation was that developed countries have good enough check and balance, but it was insufficient given that countries like US or something like that are still subject to lobbying. Companies like Apple, Nvidia, etc., are still subject to lobbying under their side. At least under our side, you have meaningful control. Under theirs, there's no meaningful check and balance. So what do I want to note here? I think that the problem with government's case is that they never explain to us why you will suddenly have good profits or optics under their side. Three reasons as to why it won't happen. A, I think that the Western countries are volatile, especially with like global tensions, like US having problems with China, etc. It was unclear to us why it would be symmetrically volatile. But secondly, then you still have to invest. In monetary instruments controlled by other companies, right? And I think that like these companies later will manage their own funds in their own self-interested ways, right? It means like if you invest into China, but China wants to lower their own currency in order to export cheaper, it means you take the harms that China imposed on themselves because China could benefit from that, but you can never meaningfully benefit from that. You only get the harms because you don't get to control the monetary policies of other countries. But see, then it was never clear to us why your portfolio as a developing countries that they characterize to be so bad will suddenly be immediately clean under their side. Because I think that insofar as they've not proven any meaningful benefit, it will still be bad to a certain extent. Before second class, yes, I'll take point.
If some countries are volatile, why can't you just invest in other countries that aren't that volatile?
Look, countries are going to be volatile to its own extent, and you cannot control countries around you. At least you could control your own country, and that is why if they want to say SWF has meaningful power, they will control their companies good, and they will control their own countries good and make it good. Second clash then, and do we get benefit fast enough? They say that it takes a long time to get return on investment. Three responses. Firstly, it doesn't always look like building school, right? It looks like building roads and infrastructure to attract foreign investment. It means we get foreign investment under our side, and these foreign investors are likely to stay under our side. There was no comparative under theirs. But secondly then, there are other forms of investing in your own country, right? It could be like quick workshops or something like that. It doesn't need to take 10 years as they characterize. It may be like just 6 months and you could make somebody that's being effective. But thirdly then, the worker for the smelters that we built under our side doesn't need that much training anyways. You could probably only teach them for 12 months or something like that, and they'll become an effective member of like the economy. There was no comparative as to why it's better under their side. Look, if everything they told you about slow benefit is true and you do buy into that panel, then it means you should vote for our side, because it was unclear to us why even in their best case scenario that they do get money from the international investment, when or how they were going to invest back into the country. At least under our side, we invest back now. Even if it takes 10 years, it's 10 years now. At their side, at best, it's 15 years. Vote for opposition.
Thank you, third opposition, for that fine speech. Let's conclude the substantive speech for this round. I'd like to invite opposition reply to sum up the case in all.
Check, check. Nice. 3, 2, 1. When the status quo looks like our LDBI counterpart struggling with internet connection when coaching in Sukawati, when their work is still so rocky that it's inhuman, we've never been prouder to oppose for them, and to say that their struggles are imaginary, like what proposition cite this, physically hurts. Before I go into my two clashes, two things I'd like to point out in this debate. One, we urge proposition to be bold. When you ask for us to trade off our benefit, please notice panels, when they themselves keep saying that they can still focus on development, is then trying to co-opt our benefits. One question to them, where is all this money for the development coming from when you focus on foreign investments personally on their side of the house? But secondly, because this is so minor but for some reason it keeps going on, why are you suggesting that domestic companies is corrupt but international companies don't? Unfortunately, when you're that bad to corrupt, no company giant is free of this sin. They just simply hide it better the bigger they get. But on to my two clashes then regarding development and investors. One on development. Simply, as a developing country, where do you get enough money or resources to prioritize both foreign investment and domestic investment? Simply, we think it's impossible. Like we've posited to you since first, your investment depend on global stability under their side of the house. They try to posit to you that we're volatile on our side when we do domestic investment. We try to posit that it's the opposite. Like we said to you since LO, for example, predicting global market is harder than predicting a weather when it's cloudy, because when countries are that secretive, when a politician bad mood can affect a market through unnecessary things such as huge tariffs, etc., that is unpredictable. And keep in mind that their case is contingent on the global economy being stable. That makes it one question. How about things like COVID? How about the Russia-Ukraine war? These things don't get accounted for on their side of the house. And we've posited to you panel since first and second, and they still ignore this harm in third. If Abian's analysis on countries' moral is true, why China and Taiwan is still so tense in the current status quo, and why the world still let it happen anyways? The way here is simple. We fail to see propositions logic when they keep pushing on you on investment, right? They keep saying if we invest in school, the benefit would only come like 6 to 7 years later, right? Simply, on their side, if you invest first without guarantee, by the way, panels, then invest in school, it'll take them even longer. It'll take them like 20 years instead under their side of the house. Their logic doesn't make sense. But secondly, on money and resources, what we posit to you since first is that we kill two birds with one stone when you focus on this one thing, which is domestic facility, two ways. A, you benefit the people that pay taxes, that actually hold you accountable. You actually give them the incentive to trust you as the governing body of those people. But also B, you don't need to reach outside to actually these companies under our side, because you just need to wait, because the incentive is already doubled under our side of the house that we posited to you since first and second. But On to my second question regarding investors. We think that the argument of second government whole case for companies to be interested in rural areas, our entire case is a prerequisite to this argument for that entire argument to apply, because we've proven to you two things here, panel. One, we've proven to you when you invest in roads, transportation, etc., only then will rural area be enticing to investors in and of itself. But also secondly, we've proven to you that it makes it cheaper on our side of the house. That's what investors actually want. And to do this, they need to prioritize domestic development and facility first and foremost before you go to outside investment under their side of the house. We think that if they try to co-opt this, they are simply being super half stands. The importance of this is simple. Our mechanization is a prerequisite to the trickle-down benefit of development, which encompasses two things. A, when you develop your foundation first, you become a stable source of survival for yourself. It makes you survive global volatility like COVID, like global tensions, etc., etc. It makes you independent. And one of the goals of developing countries such as our beloved country Indonesia is to be independent in ourselves. We don't want to be dependent on any country else, or at least keep the dependency to a minimal. But B, exactly as my third half emphasized, you can control your own country economy. You cannot control international tension. You cannot control international war. You definitely cannot control diseases like COVID. All reasons above, proud to be grand champion of NSDC 2025.
Thank you, opposition reply, for the fine remarks. Next to proposition reply, here.
Team Bali brings this very weird proposition in P2 where they say, oh, foreign individuals won't be integrated when like we tell you that they never understand the motion in the first place because this exists in an international marketplace, which means this is buy and sell. This is not a partnership. But even if you take their incorrect picturization, they've never given you a weighing on why foreign investors will be appropriate in a nation that doesn't even show interest in buying bonds. Insofar as the person next to you that these countries have unskilled workers and premature deindustrialization, then the only way to be able to catch up and start manufacturing again is through foreign money and knowledge transfer. The fact that the opposition can say, oh, we don't need to invest in like US and Apple and etc. This means that the medium voter knows exactly which countries are volatile or not. So it's unclear as to why they're portraying is that this is a shot in the dark. But this is where Kalika and Abian's call out really matters. Because note to you, when we opt into foreign investments, the urgency is to hire good people. And this matters. So we hire that Oxford or Harvard graduate because uniquely, these are the individuals who know which foreign investments are good, which means also more likely there's just much more economists and like expert knowers who are able to do things like project which companies should be invested in the first place. The reason we win is because of two things. First, Bali's case is largely uncompetitive, but second, they just have no delta. A, when you force the SWF to go into like a domestic development, you concentrate on that same fragile economy. Insofar as like the domestic, like SWF becomes domestic, their assets slot to resemble the state's existing risk profile. And this is particularly harmful, panel. Why? Because the states on other exposure are already heavily domestic. We have given to you this across the bench. So on up, you lose the SWF ability to do things because they don't have a diversified portfolio that can mobilize during things like crisis. But instead, they have a largely illiquid domestic infrastructure. We're just exposed to that same macro shocks as the rest of the economy. This is very important because in this particular moments of crisis, that same state capacity that needs an uncorrelated wealth pool just doesn't. Simply put, because when the domestic market fails, then the SWF fails with it. What does OP then have to trade off, and why is this round winning tipping point? Because SWF balance sheet fills up with like quasi-fiscal projects that belong in the budget or developmental banks, which we have told you in second, but now SWF use this for like short-term political projects like infrastructure in the first place. I'm gonna first talk about the principle. I think this debate is not about urgency, but because this is a debate about SWF in the first place. So I'm unclear as to why the domestic things have to be from SWF, like from the get-go. They have never given us like likelihood analysis and exclusivity like weighing as to why why this is uniquely only able to come from SWF and not from other things like budget and line ministries, which I've told you across the bench. But note, because of this, there are already current bodies that are already accepting, like already meant to accept things like lower financial return for higher social impact, like jobs and education, etc., which operate under procurement rules. So note that the benefit on their side is largely co-opted on ours, but we tell you the harm just cascades over time, because uniquely you don't have that unique diversified portfolio. But the reason why check and balance exists on proposition side of the house is just clear. Like on their side, KPI is unclear insofar as the returns are low. Like DPN already told you that on our side, SWF can say, oh, we actually like achieve social goals, like jobs get better, which takes away of accountability insofar as there is no like yardstick, like X% under a reference portfolio. The unique distinction panel on our side of the house that WIP did not engage to, like DPM switch at all, is first, you have transparent benchmarking against things like Bloomberg Global Aggregate. So if the SWF systematically underperforms, then it is forced like politically motivated foreign assets, then that underperformance is clearly quantifiable and clearly visible on our side of the house. So the weighing is very clear, panel. The SWF just lose the ability to diversify and stabilize. At best on our position, it will still fall under the same issues as mini-states or developmental banks, but the delta is clear. You lose a lot of the needle, you lose the last needle to stabilize the funds with stable foreign assets in times of crisis. And uniquely, these are the times that matter the most for the developing countries, because simply put, they have no other safety buffer insofar as the SWF invests in things like domestic assets. It's clear that this is a golf win, never prouder to stand as Team Banten. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Proposition Reply, for that final mark as well. That's concluded the debate for this round. For everyone, please give a massive applause for both grand finalists. Yep, that's enough, the grand final. Both teams can just cross the floor, check hand, and wait for the announcements in the closing ceremony. Best of luck, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone, and that concludes the end of the grand final round of LDI Bahasa Inggris 2025. We highly ask all participants, including juri N1 dan pembimbing masing-masing. Kami meminta seluruh peserta, termasuk pembimbing dan juri N1-nya, untuk menunggu di auditorium lantai 4 di hall ini untuk beberapa menit ke depan, karena bus bus untuk kembali ke hotel dan persiapan penutupan sedang dipersiapkan di bawah. Nomor 2, ada panitia yang akan menuju ke sini dan memberikan beberapa pengarahan singkat terkait alur kepulangan, kembali ke hotel, dan penutupan nanti. Sekali lagi, kami minta kepada seluruh peserta pendamping juri N1 seluruh provinsi untuk bisa tinggal dulu di auditorium ini untuk beberapa menit ke depan. Sebentar lagi akan ada panitia yang memberikan pengarahan singkat terkait protokol dan alur administrasi serta kepulangan dan closing ceremony nanti. Teman-teman LO dimohon bantuannya untuk menemani seluruh kontingen provinsi di auditorium lantai 4. Terima kasih.
Welcome to Yogyakarta, the city of students. The city where a significant number of public and private schools and universities are located. Universitas Atmajaya Yogyakarta, a private university established on September 27, 1965 by Yayasan Slamet Riyadi Yogyakarta.
Dalam bahasa Sanskerta, Atma berarti jiwa dan jaya berarti unggul. Sehingga Atmajaya berarti jiwa yang unggul. Universitas Atmajaya Yogyakarta juga memiliki semboyan dalam bahasa Latin Serviens in Lumine Veritatis yang artinya melayani dalam cahaya kebenaran.
The four core values upheld by UAJE are excellence, inclusivity, humanism, and integrity. Excellence implies a quality or being better than others. Inclusivity means encompassing all social groups. Humanism, the definition, means to serve the common interest of fellow humans. Integrity means adherence to the moral and ethical principles, honesty, reliability, consistency in words and acts, and a sense of responsibility. UAJE supports diverse values, cultures, religions, races, ethnicities, and languages as a university with students from all across Indonesia. UAJE's diversity is an asset for further collaboration and synergy in preparing for a better future.
Universitas Atmajaya Yogyakarta memiliki 4 kampus yang terbagi menjadi Kampus 1, Gedung Santo Alfonsus. Kampus 2, Gedung Santo Thomas Aquinas. Kampus 3, Gedung Santo Bonaventura. Dan Kampus 4, Gedung Bunda Teresa. Universitas Atmajaya Yogyakarta memiliki fakultas dengan berbagai program studi sarjana, program studi magister, dan international undergraduate program.
Universitas Atmajaya Yogyakarta is a second home for every individual to develop and share information, and a university with a high-quality education to attain unlimited aspirations and accomplishments. To achieve the goals, UAJE provides classrooms with hybrid learning system, laboratories in each faculty as a room to explore, co-working space as a discussion room, medical personnel who are always available in the university clinic room, and a library that provide books, e-books, and digital libraries to open a wide window onto the world in various ways.
UAJ selalu konsisten memberikan pelayanan yang didasari rasa solidaritas kepada sesama. Selama saya bekerja di UAJY, saya merasakan kekeluargaan yang sangat kuat menjadi dasar bagi seluruh sivitas akademika.